Chapter 1. The coins whisper the rain in the lower docks of Qingzhou was a persistent greasy drizzle, clinging to the slate roofs and slicking the cobblestones into a treacherous mirror of the gaslights. It smelled of salt, fish, and something metallic, a faint, insistent tang that clung to the air, the scent of 1,000 coins. Julian Sterling, disguised as Elias Thorne, a coin sorter, found it oddly comforting. It was a world of quantifiable things, of weight and magnetism, a stark contrast to the nebulous calculations and shifting fortunes of the Sterling banking house. He shifted, adjusting the worn leather apron that felt stubbornly itchy against his skin. The basement of Master Lin's establishment, Lin's Precision Coins, was a dim claustrophobic space, perpetually filled with the gentle rattle and clatter of hundreds of copper tokens, iron washers, and brass pins. Master Lin, a wizened, silent man with eyes like polished jade, seemed more interested in the rhythm of the sorting than in his apprentice. Lin simply offered gruff instructions faster, Thorne. Less hesitation, and expected meticulous results. He hadn't asked Julian's origins, hadn't questioned the awkwardness with which he handled the heavier pieces. Perhaps he simply found Heim useful. The work was brutal. Hours were spent kneeling on a low, scarred wooden table, separating coins based on size and magnetic charge. The air was thick with dust, and a dull ache blossomed in Julian's shoulders with each shift. Had arrived in Qingzhou 6 months ago, ostensibly for a period of reflection after a particularly brutal board meeting at the Sterling banking house, a meeting dominated by his uncle, Silas, and his thinly veiled contempt for Julian's lack of interest in serious financial matters. Had chosen Qingzhou, a sprawling port city riddled with corruption, as a deliberate act of rebellion. The lower docks, a festering wound on the city's face, seemed the perfect place to vanish, to shed the suffocating weight of his inheritance. He was, of course, terrible at it. The delicate art of discerning subtle magnetic differences was utterly foreign to him. He frequently missorted pieces, causing a cascade of clattering coins and Master Lin's barely contained sighs. It was during one of these clumsy moments that he first encountered Garrick Vance. Vance, the son of Director Vance, the brutal administrator of the city's tax collection, was a study in arrogant entitlement. He was a mountain of muscle and arrogance, perpetually clad in fine silks and sporting a meticulously groomed mustache that seemed to vibrate with disdain. Had begun his tests with a casual disregard, dropping a small iron strongbox toward Julian's hands, a childish game of provocation. Julian, initially, had instinctively raised his arms, a reflexive reaction ingrained from years of navigating the treacherous currents of the Sterling family's court, but the strongbox landed squarely in his lap, scattering a scattering of brass pins across the floor. Vance, with a theatrical flourish, positioned himself as a footstool, sinking heavily onto the box. "Those who count other men's wealth are nothing but the dirt beneath the vault," he declared, his voice dripping with scorn. Then he proceeded to systematically demand Julian retrieve the scattered pins with his fingernails, a humiliating display of power designed to break Julian's spirit. Thankfully, Elena was there. She appeared silently, a slight figure emerging from the shadows of the forge across the alley. Elena, the retired metallurgist, was a woman weathered by years of working with fire and metal. Her hands were scarred, her eyes held a quiet intensity, and she possessed an uncanny ability to perceive the subtle nuances of metal, a skill that made her a valuable asset to the docks fishermen. She'd begun bringing Julian simple meals, thick, savory stews, and freshly baked bread, and she fiercely defended him against Vance's taunts. "He is a craftsman, Vance," Shed said, her voice surprisingly firm, after Vance had deliberately knocked over a stack of coins, sending them rolling across the floor. "Not a plaything." Julian found himself drawn to her quiet strength, to the way she saw beyond his clumsy fade. He was beginning to understand that his carefully constructed disguise wasn't just about hiding his true identity. It was about creating a space where he could finally be real. Tonight, however, the atmosphere was different. A palpable tension hung in the air, thick with the anticipation of the Festival of the Mint, a celebration of the city's coin production, and a prime opportunity for Director Vance to flex his muscle. As the last rays of the setting sun bled across the sky, Julian heard the telltale clang of armored boots and the raucous shouts of Vance's enforcers. The festival had begun, and with it, a storm of corruption. Chapter 2. The Resonance of Steel. The air in the basement of the coin sorting depot was thick with the smell of oiled metal and dust, now underscored by the metallic tang of rising adrenaline. The Festival of the Mint had descended upon the docks like a swarm of wasps, a chaotic, glittering assault on the senses, fueled by forced revelry and the blatant display of Vance's power. Julian, meticulously separating copper tokens into neat piles, attempted to ignore the cacophony, the blaring horns, the boisterous shouts, and the increasingly aggressive presence of Vance's armored enforcers. He focused on the rhythmic motion of his hands, the almost meditative precision had cultivated over years of training, burying the rising panic beneath a veneer of stoic calm. Elena, surprisingly, was also present, her presence a quiet counterpoint to the surrounding frenzy. She was examining a newly forged fishing hook, meticulously testing its balance and resilience with a practiced eye, seemingly oblivious to the escalating commotion. She had been unusually quiet tonight, her focus solely on her work, which was unsettling. Suddenly, the noise shifted, growing into a roar. Garrick Vance, a hulking figure adorned in polished steel armor, burst into the sorting depot, flanked by a dozen enforcers wielding crude, spiked batons. The air crackled with malice. "Well, well, well," Garrick boomed, his voice dripping with contempt. "Look what we have here." A humble coin sorter, attempting to disappear into the shadows. "I'm here to ensure you understand your place, Sterling." He gestured with his hand, and the enforcers began to advance, their batons raised. Julian, despite the palpable threat, remained motionless. Had anticipated this Vance's penchant for provocation, his eagerness to demonstrate his dominance. Had spent the last few days carefully adjusting his posture, mentally preparing for this moment. He recognized it now, not as a challenge to be met with force, but an opportunity to test the limits of his carefully constructed reality. As the first enforcer swung his baton, aimed at Julian's head, time seemed to distort. It wasn't a conscious action, not a deliberate unleashing of power. It was a reaction, a honed instinct triggered by a lifetime of disciplined training, a subconscious adjustment to a subtle shift in the very fabric of the environment. He simply shifted his weight, bringing his heel down with a surprising force onto the cobblestones beneath his feet. A low, almost subsonic hum emanated from the stone, rising in intensity, vibrating through Julian's bones. It was a resonance he'd learned to control, a focused amplification of the magnetic field inherent in the Earth itself, the Giga-Gauss state. This time, however, it wasn't the controlled containment he'd practiced. It was an eruption. The enforcer's baton, mid-swing, froze inches from Julian's face, spinning wildly as if caught in an invisible current. The other enforcers, caught completely off guard, staggered backward, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. Garrick, momentarily stunned, roared in disbelief as his own steel broadsword, which had been casually holding, began to tremble violently. Then, with a horrifying metallic shriek, the sword shattered, not with a clang, but with a cascade of razor-sharp fragments, showering the floor and the bewildered enforcers in a rain of steel. The air filled with the scent of burnt metal and ozone. Julian hadn't raised a hand, hadn't uttered a word. He had simply been a conduit for a power far beyond comprehension. Elena, who had been calmly examining the hook, straightened, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and apprehension. She saw the scene unfolding with an unsettling clarity. recognizing the impossible nature of what was happening. She rushed forward, shielding Julian from a stray shard of steel with her body. "Julian," she shouted, her voice strained. What was that?" As Julian began to regain his composure, he realized that the effect wasn't limited to Garrick's sword. The Enforcer's armor, intricate plates of steel and leather, began to lock together, fusing into a single, monstrous mass. Their movements became increasingly erratic, as if controlled by an external force. They were trapped, frozen in a grotesque tableau of metallic entanglement. "The magnetic field," Julian murmured, his voice strained. I amplified it." Garrick, struggling against the restraints, bellowed with fury. "You are a demon, Sterling. A blight upon this city." He lunged at Julian, his face contorted with rage, but it was too late. Julian, with a subtle movement of his hand, channeled the amplified magnetic field, pulling Garrick and his remaining enforcers into a spiraling vortex of twisted metal, dragging them across the cobblestones with brutal force. The Festival of the Mint, already a chaotic mess, descended into utter pandemonium. The remaining onlookers, witnessing the impossible, scattered in terror, their cheers replaced with screams. Julian stood amidst the wreckage, a single, unnervingly calm figure in a sea of chaos, the fragments of Garrick's shattered sword hovering silently around his head like a halo of lethal silver. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that his carefully constructed disguise had been irrevocably shattered, not just by the events of the night, but by the breathtaking, terrifying power he now wielded. Chapter 3. The Echo of Resonance. The silence following the second, more devastating application of the magnetic core was thick, heavy, with the smell of scorched metal and raw terror. The cobblestones of the lower docks were a swirling mosaic of broken steel, shattered brass, and the slick residue of amplified magnetic energy. The Enforcers, once a disciplined force of 30, were now a collection of immobile, twisted statues, each a horrifying testament to Julian's growing mastery. Even the air felt charged, humming with a subtle, unsettling resonance. Elena, miraculously unharmed despite being jostled violently during the vortex, stood a short distance away, her face pale but resolute. She wasn't screaming, wasn't even trembling. Instead, she stared at Julian with a mixture of awe and profound unease. The fragments of the sword, still suspended in the air around him, seemed to reflect her own gaze, a silent acknowledgement of the immense, terrifying power he now possessed. What was that?" she finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. How is this even possible?" Julian's expression was carefully neutral, a practiced mask of controlled calm. He took a slow, deliberate step towards her, the movement fluid and graceful, a stark contrast to the brutal devastation had just wrought. "The magnetic core," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority, "is far more than I initially understood. It isn't simply about manipulating metal, Elena. It's about resonance, about tapping into the fundamental forces that bind all matter together." He gestured towards the frozen enforcers. "Each object, each particle, vibrates with a unique magnetic signature. I can amplify those signatures, create a feedback loop, and essentially seize control of that vibration. It's like conducting a symphony with metal itself." He paused, acutely aware of the stunned silence of the remaining onlookers, a handful of fishermen, a few merchants who'd witnessed the carnage, and a scattering of children who hadn't yet grasped the full horror of what they'd seen. "The disruption I caused wasn't just a localized effect," he continued. "It's reverberated throughout the entire district. The very structures, the buildings, the tools, even the ships in the harbor, are now subtly affected by the resonance." A low groan emanated from the frozen enforcers as Julian began to subtly shift his focus, as if testing the limits of his control. The air grew colder, the magnetic hum intensified, and a small, rusty iron bucket, lying discarded near a fish stall, began to vibrate violently, spinning slowly in the air, before crashing back to the ground with a metallic clang. It's destabilizing everything," Elena gasped, her eyes wide with dread. "We need to stop you, Julian. This is madness." "I haven't come to unleash chaos, Elena," he replied, his voice firm. "I've come to dismantle a system built on corruption and exploitation. Vance and his family have bled the city dry, manipulating the currency, terrorizing the populace, and hoarding wealth for their own selfish gain. This was merely a demonstration of what I can do." Suddenly, a shadow fell over them. Grand Governor Sterling, his face a mask of controlled fury, stood at the edge of the crowd, flanked by 2 heavily armored guards. He was followed by a contingent of soldiers, their faces grim, their hands gripping unfamiliar weapons that shimmered with a faint blue energy. "Sterling," he barked, his voice amplified by a small, handheld device. "You are under arrest for treason, inciting violence, and the attempted assassination of a member of the Imperial Guard." Julian remained impassive. "I assure you, Governor," he said, his eyes fixed on his father, "am not interested in treason. Am interested in justice." "Justice?" Sterling scoffed. "You are a dangerous madman, wielding power that belongs only to the Emperor. You will be brought to justice, and your justice will be dealt with accordingly." Before Sterling could order his guards to move, Julian raised a hand, and the magnetic resonance intensified. This time, it wasn't targeted. Instead, it washed over the entire square, subtly shifting the angle of the guards' weapons, altering the trajectory of their movements, and even causing the polished armor plates to subtly shift against each other, creating a chaotic ballet of near misses. "You misunderstand, Father," Julian said, a hint of steel in his voice. "The power of the magnetic core isn't about force. It's about control, and I intend to wield it." As the last of the soldiers faltered, disoriented, and struggling to maintain their balance, Julian turned to Elena, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "It seems," he said, "the echoes of this night will resonate far beyond these docks." Chapter 4. The Resonance of Metal. The rain had stopped, leaving the cobblestone streets slick and reflecting the stark, newly established light of the Imperial Guard's armored lanterns. The square, once a tangle of panicked bodies and shimmering metal, now bore the heavy imprint of Julian's intervention, a chaotic mosaic of crushed armor, snapped weaponry, and a lingering, almost tangible vibration in the air. Governor Sterling, a man used to absolute deference, stood rigid beside his son, his face a mask of bewildered fury. The remaining Imperial Guard, a dozen men stripped of their dignity and weapons, shifted uneasily, acutely aware that they'd been the unwilling subjects of a demonstration of power beyond their comprehension. This is impossible," Sterling sputtered, his voice strained. "The magnetic core? A legend, a whispered tale among the scholars. You claim to control metal with your mind?" Julian remained calm, observing his father with a detached, almost clinical gaze. He adjusted the small palm-sized device, a refinement of a basic sonic resonator head, discovered amongst the dock's forgotten workshops, and emitted a low, pulsing hum. It wasn't a weapon, not directly. Instead, it amplified the residual magnetic resonance still clinging to the ground, a subtle reminder of the chaos had unleashed. "Legends often have roots in truth, Father. The magnetic core is a refinement of an ancient martial art, one that allows for the manipulation of magnetic fields, a fundamental force in the universe." He turned to Elena, who stood near the forge, her face etched with a mixture of awe and apprehension. She hadn't spoken since the shattering of Garrick's sword, but her eyes, the color of hammered steel, held a profound understanding. You sensed it, didn't you, Elena? Julian asked, his voice soft. The shift in the magnetic field? A constant presence, a subtle song. Most people are too deaf to hear it. Elena nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on him. It was overwhelming, like a storm of metal, yet perfectly ordered. Your control is absolute, but it requires a deep understanding, a resonance with the metal itself. Sterling, unable to process the situation, continued to interrogate Julian. You've manipulated the Imperial Guard. You've defied my authority. And you've proven yourself a dangerous anomaly. You'll be confined, studied, and eventually rendered harmless. Julian simply raised his hand again, and this time, the sonic resonator emitted a higher frequency, a wave of directed energy that washed over the surrounding buildings. The bricks of the surrounding warehouses seemed to subtly shift, their alignment subtly adjusted, creating a barely perceptible, yet undeniably forceful, resistance. I don't seek confinement, Father, Julian said, his voice carrying a newfound conviction. I seek to correct a grave injustice. These docks, these people, have been exploited for generations by your banking house, by men like Vance, who cling to power with a desperate, corrupt hunger. Your justice will not be delivered in a courtroom. It will be delivered in the silent, unwavering force of metal. He turned his attention to a stack of metal tools neatly arranged near the forge, a collection of hammers, tongs, and chisels Elena had painstakingly repaired. With a flick of his wrist, he activated the magnetic core. The tools began to levitate, rotating slowly in the air, responding to his will. He picked up a heavy hammer, effortlessly lifting it above his head, then gently lowered it back down, demonstrating the controlled power at his disposal. This, he said, gesturing to the swirling tools, is not destruction. It's precision. It's the ability to shape, to redirect, to influence. Suddenly, a deep, resonant voice echoed from the edge of the square. It was Master Jian, the aged, enigmatic martial arts instructor, who had been a silent observer throughout the confrontation. He stepped forward, his movements slow but deliberate, his eyes radiating an ancient wisdom. The young master's control is impressive, Governor, Jian said, his voice carrying an undeniable weight. But the magnetic core is not merely a weapon. It is a discipline, a pathway to understanding the very nature of reality. It demands respect, humility, and a profound connection to the forces that govern our world. He looked at Julian, his gaze piercing. You have tapped into a powerful current, son, Dottie. But a current without direction will only lead to devastation. Julian acknowledged Jian's words with a nod. I understand, Master Jian. Control is not simply about power, it's about responsibility. Sterling, witnessing this display of power, a mixture of fear and grudging admiration warring within him, issued a command. Secure him. Bring him before me. The Imperial Guard, their faces grim, moved forward. But as they approached, Julian raised his hand once more. The sonic resonator pulsed, and this time, the effect was different. Not a violent disruption, but a subtle disorientation. The guards stumbled, their movements becoming jerky, their balance momentarily compromised. They were not restrained, but rendered subtly vulnerable. Julian turned to Elena, his expression a mixture of apology and reassurance. Forgive my methods, Elena, he said, his voice laced with sincerity. I cannot simply offer you justice, I must demonstrate it. He picked up a handful of the tiny brass pins Garrick had scattered across the floor, and with a controlled burst of magnetic energy, arranged them perfectly into a miniature, gleaming cityscape, a silent indictment of the vanity and greed that had brought him to this point. Let this be a testament, he said, his voice resonating with quiet power, to a new order. Chapter 5. The Forge of Redemption. The air in L&S. Forge hung thick with the scent of molten steel, and the quiet hum of her meticulous work. The metallic cityscape, a miniature representation of the dock's corrupted wealth, remained perched on a wooden workbench, a mesmerizing display of controlled magnetic force. The Imperial Guard, still reeling from Julian's earlier disorientation, stood rigidly in the center of the forge, their armor gleaming under the flickering lamplight. Commander Zhao, a veteran with a face etched with years of service, approached Julian, his footsteps measured and respectful. "Master Sterling," Zhao said, his voice a low rumble, "your actions today have shocked the entire court. The Grand Governor demands an explanation, and assurances that this demonstration of power will not be repeated." Julian, leaning against a workbench, his hands calmly sorting through a small pile of copper shavings, offered a small, thoughtful smile. "Commander, I understand your concern. My intentions were not to intimidate, but to illustrate the consequences of unchecked greed. These tiny pins represent the wasted lives, the shattered dreams, the very fabric of this district torn apart by the Vance's pursuit of profit." He gestured towards the miniature cityscape. "But this is not a threat, but a reflection. It reveals a truth they sought to bury. That true strength lies not in dominating others, but in shaping the world around us." A tense silence hung in the air, broken only by the rhythmic clang of Elena hammering a piece of steel. Suddenly, a gruff voice cut through the quiet. "Don't listen to the fancy words, Sterling. Here's a trick. Just like those forgeries he claimed to expose." It was Director Vance, brought before Julian by a contingent of Imperial guards, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. He glared at Julian, a silver-handled dagger glinting at his hip. "You used magic to disable us," Garrick spat, his voice dripping with venom. "That's not justice, it's sorcery. I demand you stand trial for sedition and assault." Julian calmly straightened up, his eyes fixing on Garrick with an unnerving intensity. "Trial? You've already been judged, Garrick. Your actions, your brutality, your corruption are the evidence. I'm not here to punish you, I'm here to offer a different path." He slowly extended his hand, the faint blue glow of the magnetic core beginning to emanate from his palm. The air around him seemed to thicken, vibrating with suppressed energy. Garrick, instinctively recoiling, drew his dagger, but before he could react, a focused wave of magnetic force emanated from Julian, not forceful enough to harm, but precise enough to snatch the dagger from his hand. It spun through the air, landing perfectly in Elena's outstretched hand, a silent testament to Julian's control. "Control, Garrick," Julian said, his voice gaining a subtle resonance. "It is not about wielding power, but about understanding its flow, about recognizing that every action has a reaction, every force a counterbalance." Elena, who had been watching the scene with a mixture of apprehension and fascination, stepped forward. "Commander, I believe we've witnessed a demonstration of a power far beyond our comprehension. This man, this Sterling, is not merely a coin sorter. He is something else entirely." Commander Zhao, observing Julian's effortless control, his unwavering gaze, and the subtle manipulation of the magnetic field, began to shift his assessment. He signaled to his guards, who cautiously approached Julian, not with hostility, but with a wary curiosity. "Master Sterling," Zhao said, his tone now respectful, "the Grand Governor wants to understand this. He wishes to see this magnetic core you wield." Julian considered this for a moment. "Very well. But understand this, I will not perform for your amusement. I will demonstrate its potential for the benefit of this district, and for the future of the Empire." He then began a slow, deliberate process. With a focused concentration, he picked up a massive iron anvil, a relic from Elena's forge, easily weighing several hundred pounds. The air around the anvil shimmered with the blue glow of the magnetic core. He raised his hand, and the anvil began to levitate, suspended a foot above the ground, rotating slowly. "The magnetic core," Julian explained, his voice resonating with a deep understanding. allows me to manipulate the inherent energies of metal. It's not simply about pushing and pulling, it's about understanding the underlying forces that bind matter together. He then carefully, with a movement of his hand, bent the anvil into a graceful, intricate curve, a demonstration of incredible precision and control. The Imperial Guards gasped. Commander Zhao stood transfixed, and even Garrick, momentarily subdued by the sheer power on display, stared in stunned silence. Elena, watching her former protector display this awe-inspiring ability, approached him, her face filled with admiration and something akin to hope. "You have tapped into a current, Master Sterling," she said, her voice soft. "But you are not just controlling it, you are guiding it. You have given this land a new direction, a new rhythm." Julian nodded, his gaze fixed on Elena. "The work has only just begun." Chapter 6. Echoes of the Forge. The days following the Festival of the Mint were a whirlwind of bewildered pronouncements and hastily scribbled decrees. Emperor Li himself, alerted by frantic reports relayed by Commander Zhao, arrived in the lower docks 3 days later, a shimmering gilded presence amidst the grime and shattered steel. His arrival wasn't the dignified procession Julian had anticipated. It was a blatant display of power. A fleet of heavily armed, gold-plated dreadnoughts, each bearing the Sterling banking house crest, anchoring in the harbor, effectively securing the entire region under the family's thumb. Julian, now formally acknowledged as the heir, presented himself before his father, Grand Governor Silas Sterling, a man carved from granite and etched with the ruthless calculations of a centuries-old banking dynasty. Silas, initially radiating disdain, was visibly shaken by the sheer force of Julian's revelation and the undeniable demonstration of the magnetic core. The sight of the shattered broadsword, the levitating anvil, and the precisely sculpted curve of the iron. It was a display of power that dwarfed even the most formidable military force. You are the heir," Silas finally managed, his voice a low rumble of disbelief. "And you have been hiding this gift within a coin-sorting shed." Julian offered a polite, almost apologetic bow. "My father, I understand your confusion. The Sterling banking house has historically prioritized strategic acquisitions and influence through indirect means. The magnetic core was a forgotten legacy, a discipline deliberately obscured to prevent it from falling into the hands of those who would exploit its power." Silas, despite his initial skepticism, recognized the monumental shift. His entire empire, built on control of currency and resources, now hinged on this one man, this unassuming clerk who could wield metal itself. Meanwhile, the lower docks were in chaos. While Julian swiftly addressed the immediate needs, ensuring the safety of the workers, providing temporary shelter, and most importantly, dismantling Vance's operation, he was acutely aware that the repercussions of his actions extended far beyond the immediate district. The revelation of the magnetic core had ignited a fervor amongst the Imperial Guard, a desperate scramble for knowledge, and whispers of a hidden martial art capable of reshaping the very foundations of the Empire. Elena, appointed as High Overseer of the Imperial Mint, was navigating this new landscape with a quiet, methodical grace. The Industrial Academy she oversaw quickly became a hub of experimentation, drawing ambitious young metallurgists and martial artists from across the Empire. Julian, understanding her innate abilities, tasked her with developing methods to safely harness the magnetic core's energy, establishing protocols for its use, and training a select group of individuals, primarily the most disciplined among the Guard, in its control. "The key," Elena explained to a particularly eager young guard named Lin, while inspecting a new, magnetically reinforced vault door, "is not brute force. The magnetic core responds to intention, to understanding. It's a dance between will and metal, a conversation, not a command." This approach proved crucial. Lin, under Elena's tutelage, discovered he wasn't merely manipulating metal, he was sensing the flow of magnetic energy, within the materials themselves, anticipating their movements with remarkable accuracy. Back in his temporary office, a repurposed storeroom within the rebuilt mint, Julian continued to refine his strategy. He realized that revealing the full extent of the magnetic core's potential too quickly would only fuel the power struggles that had defined the Sterling banking house for generations. His goal wasn't to become a conqueror, but to subtly shift the balance of power, to dismantle the corrupt elite and build a more equitable empire. He received a coded message from Commander Zhao, detailing a series of clandestine meetings held by Vance's surviving enforcers, now scattered and demoralized. They were attempting to locate remnants of the shattered broadsword, hoping to salvage fragments and unlock its secrets. Julian anticipated this. He had deployed a network of informants primarily among the dockworkers to monitor their movements. "They are attempting to analyze the fragments," Zhao reported grimly. "They believe there's a pattern, a harmonic resonance within the shattered metal." Julian paused, a subtle flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "Let them persist. Knowledge is valuable, but it's more valuable when wielded responsibly. I will arrange a private demonstration for them tomorrow. Let them witness the true potential of the magnetic core for the benefit of this district and for the future of the Empire." That evening, he sought out Elena, finding her in her forge, painstakingly shaping a new tool for a fisherman, her movements deliberate and focused. The air around her hummed with a faint, familiar energy. "You've made remarkable progress, Elena," Julian said, watching her work. "The Academy is thriving, and your insights are invaluable." Elena paused, wiping the sweat from her brow. "I sense a shadow, Master Sterling. A lingering echo of those who seek to exploit your power." Julian nodded, his expression grim. "They will not succeed. We are building something new here, something rooted in understanding and respect. Let them pursue their obsession. Let them believe they can control the mountain of gold, but they will never understand the rhythm." Chapter 7. The Resonance of Ruin. The rain that fell on the 7th day of the Festival of the Mint was a cold, insistent drumming, mirroring the rising tension in the lower docks. The initial spectacle of Vance's manufactured crisis had given way to a grim, practical reality. The Sterling banking house, disguised as a simple merchant, was systematically dismantling the corrupt elite. Julian, still clad in the simple tunic of a coin sorter, had become a symbol of quiet, devastating power. Zhao, his most trusted lieutenant, a former imperial scholar disillusioned with the bureaucracy, confirmed the unsettling developments. "The analysts are getting closer, Master Sterling. They've identified the core resonance, a repeating sequence within the magnetic fracturing. It's incredibly intricate, almost as if the weapon wasn't merely breaking the metal, but altering its structure at a fundamental level." Julian, seated in a small, hastily constructed observation post overlooking the docks, a repurposed storage container, draped with drab canvas, steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed on the chaotic scene. Vance's enforcers, subdued but still menacing, were attempting to collect the last of the shattered broadsword fragments. Garrick, a furious, sweating silhouette, oversaw the operation, barking orders at a team of technicians wielding magnets and measuring instruments. The air crackled with a nervous energy, not just from the rain, but from the palpable sense that they were being studied, dissected, and ultimately understood. "Let them continue," Julian said, his voice calm, almost meditative. "But do not provide them with solutions. Let them chase the ghost of control. Their obsession is their weakness." Elena, having spent the morning assisting the analysts, joined him. Her presence always shifted the atmosphere, softening the sharp edges of Julian's calculations with a quiet, grounded wisdom. She carried a small, intricately carved wooden box, a miniature replica of the docks, filled with tiny, precisely balanced magnetic pebbles. "They've developed a device, Master Sterling," she said, her voice low, her fingers tracing the contours of the wooden dock. "A resonance amplifier. They're attempting to replicate the shattering effect." but they're struggling to maintain the coherence. It's like trying to capture lightning in a bottle. The energy dissipates almost instantly. The magnetic core isn't just about brute force, Julian observed, tapping a finger against his chin. It's about harmony, about manipulating the inherent forces within matter. They're treating it like a siege engine, rather than a dance. Suddenly, a sharp intake of breath from Zhao. Master, the analysts have discovered something unexpected. The resonance isn't just about shattering. It's imprinted. There are patterns within the fragments, complex geometric sequences, that suggest the weapon wasn't just designed to break metal. It was designed to record magnetic signatures. A knot tightened in Julian's stomach. The revelation was unsettling, profoundly so. If the magnetic core could record, it could also transmit. The implications were staggering. Increase surveillance on the analysts. Discreetly. I want to know who is feeding them information. Someone clearly knows more than they're letting on. As they discussed the implications, a flicker of movement caught Julian's eye. One of the technicians, a young man named Lee, was staring intently at Elena's wooden dock. He reached out a hesitant hand, touching the tiny, magnetic pebbles. A faint shimmer, almost invisible, pulsed around the dock. Before Julian could react, Lee's eyes widened with a strange, disoriented expression. He stumbled back, clutching his head, muttering, "The rhythm, it's overwhelming." Elena, reacting instinctively, snatched the dock from him. The shimmering ceased. Lee, pale and shaken, stared at her with a mixture of fear and bewilderment. "You've touched something you shouldn't have, young man," Julian said, his voice hardening. He stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Lee's shoulder. "The magnetic core isn't a weapon of destruction. It's a key. And some keys are meant to remain hidden." As he spoke, a subtle shift occurred. The rain seemed to intensify, coalescing into a visible shimmer around Julian, and the faint hum of the Giga Gauss state, a power he rarely consciously accessed, grew stronger, more focused. He raised his hand, and a single copper coin, lying on the cobblestones, levitated effortlessly into the air, rotating slowly, radiating a faint, pulsating magnetic field. It wasn't an act of force, but a demonstration, a silent, potent warning. "The rhythm," Julian said, his eyes fixed on Lee, "is not about control. It's about understanding. And sometimes, the greatest danger lies not in those who seek to wield power, but in those who seek to comprehend it." Chapter 8. Echoes of the Core. The rain continued its relentless drumming, now laced with a peculiar, almost metallic tang. The scene around the docks had shifted, not just due to the storm, but because of the quiet, palpable tension radiating from Julian. Lee remained a shell of his former self, sitting rigidly on a crate, occasionally blinking, as if struggling to reconcile the world he knew with the undeniable reality he had briefly glimpsed. Ilana, ever vigilant, kept a watchful eye on him, her brow furrowed with a mixture of concern and a nascent understanding of the forces at play. "You were right, Master Julian," she said, her voice low, almost reverent. "The rhythm, it's not about control. It's about resonance." Julian nodded, his gaze scanning the surrounding docks. The effect of his demonstration hadn't faded entirely. Tiny metal shavings clung to the air, swirling slightly, drawn to an unseen magnetic pull. He closed his eyes, focusing, extending his awareness, a subtle intensification of the Giga Gauss state humming beneath his skin. It felt like wading through a viscous, shimmering ocean, the sensation both unsettling and profoundly exhilarating. "This dock," he said, opening his eyes, "was built with a specific type of iron ore, one with a natural, subtle polarity." Lee's touch disrupted that harmony. The magnetic core isn't a simple amplification of force. It's a connection to a deeper, universal rhythm governing all metals. Suddenly, a low, guttural laugh echoed across the docks. Garrick Vance, accompanied by a contingent of his remaining enforcers, materialized from the shadows, his face contorted with fury. He hadn't bothered to conceal his disdain. So, the clumsy clerk is a sorcerer, is he? Turning pennies into missiles with his little parlor trick. He gestured dismissively, with a hand that still bore the faint impressions of the shattered sword fragments. It's a pathetic display, Sterling. You've spent weeks hiding, learning your tricks. You think you can just waltz in here and frighten us? You're nothing but a boy playing at power. Julian remained impassive, his posture radiating an almost unbearable stillness. He didn't move, didn't speak, allowing the weight of his power, subtly intensified, to hang in the air. He felt Garrick's arrogance, his fear, his desperate attempt to cling to a dwindling advantage. It was like probing a ripe fruit, knowing precisely where to apply the pressure to bring it to its breaking point. Then, it began. Not with a dramatic display of force, but with a delicate shift. The rain, already swirling, began to condense, forming tiny, perfectly shaped droplets of water that hovered in the air around the docks, attracted to a localized magnetic field. Each droplet remained suspended, reflecting the flickering light, creating a miniature, iridescent rainbow. You understand now, don't you, Garrick? Julian's voice was soft, laced with a quiet authority. The magnetic core isn't just about bending metal. It's about shaping the very fabric of reality. Where everything water, air, even thought, is governed by invisible currents of energy. You sought to destroy it. I seek to understand it. Garrick's bravado faltered. His enforcers shifted uneasily. They had trained for combat, for brute force, but this was something else entirely. He lunged forward, drawing his massive, newly forged broadsword, a weapon head undoubtedly commissioned with the best materials and a dark intent. Before he could even raise the blade, Julian moved. Not with a sudden, explosive surge of power, but with a fluid, almost graceful motion. He didn't block, didn't parry. Instead, he extended his hand, palm open, towards the sword. The rain intensified, coalescing into a dense, shimmering curtain around them, amplifying the magnetic field. The sword shuddered, vibrating violently, mirroring the earlier disintegration. But this time, it wasn't shattering. Instead, the blade began to rotate, slowly, relentlessly, spinning on its axis with a growing speed, drawing in every stray metal object, nails, coins, even the corroded remains of a discarded wagon wheel. It became a miniature vortex of metal, whirling with increasing intensity, trapped within a localized magnetic bubble generated by Julian's will. The rhythm, Garrick, Julian said, his voice calm and measured. It doesn't simply break things. It contains them. It isolates them. He didn't destroy the sword, he imprisoned it, a glittering, spinning testament to his mastery. As the vortex reached its peak, a deep, resonant hum filled the air, echoing off the stone walls of the docks. Lee, who had been frozen in terror, suddenly straightened, his eyes alight with a strange, knowing glint. He took a tentative step forward, reaching out a hand towards the whirling sword. This time, he didn't stumble. He didn't flinch. He understood. The rhythm was not a threat, but an invitation. Chapter 9. Echoes of the core. The rain continued its relentless drumming, now laced with a subtle metallic scent, the lingering aroma of magnetic disruption. Director Vance stood frozen, a statue of furious rage and bewildered confusion. The miniature vortex still spun, a captivating nightmare of silver and steel, meticulously contained within the sphere of Julian's control. 50 of his enforcers lay scattered and immobile, their armor fused into a grotesque, swirling heap. He hadn't destroyed them, had rendered them utterly powerless, trapped in a prison of their own composition. It's not about brute force, is it, Director? Julian's voice, amplified by the strange resonance of the core, carried an unsettling calmness. It's about understanding the fundamental laws that govern this world, and bending them to your will. Garrick, still clutching the broken hilt of his broadsword, glared at Julian with venomous disbelief. You're a sorcerer. "A demon," he sputtered, his voice cracking with the strain of denial. "A craftsman," Julian corrected, gesturing towards the still spinning vortex. "A craftsman of metal. And you, Director, were attempting to use a tool without understanding its nature. You thought to break it, and instead, I showed you how to contain it." Suddenly, a figure emerged from the swirling chaos, Lee, the dock worker, no longer paralyzed by fear, but radiating a quiet intensity. He moved with a deliberate grace, approaching the spinning sword with a measured step. The rain seemed to part around him, as if acknowledging a higher order. He extended a hand, not to touch the vortex but to simply observe it, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The core," Lee said, his voice low and resonant, echoing Julian's earlier observation. "It's not simply a destructive force. It's a reflection of the universe itself, a constant interplay of opposing energies. To break something is to interrupt that flow, to contain it is to restore balance." Julian nodded, a subtle approval in his expression. He sensed a nascent understanding dawning within Lee. A connection to the magnetic principles had been painstakingly developing. This wasn't just about manipulating metal. It was about manipulating reality itself. "You've seen it, then," Julian said, turning to Elena, who had been watching the scene with a mixture of disbelief and profound recognition. "You understand the potential." Elena stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the swirling vortex, then on Julian. "It's not a weapon, Master Sterling," she said, her voice steady. "It's an echo, a reflection of the core's ancient rhythms. The core doesn't seek to destroy. It seeks to harmonize." As she spoke, the rotation of the vortex slowed. The humming subsided, and the shimmering rain dissipated, revealing the stunned faces of the onlookers. The sword, now still and silent, hung suspended in midair, a captured masterpiece of craftsmanship. Julian reached out and gently touched the blade. A faint blue energy pulsed through his hand, and the sword's surface seemed to momentarily brighten, as if remembering its own purpose. He withdrew his hand, and the sword settled back onto the cobblestones, perfectly intact. "The key," he explained, turning to Lee, "is not simply the ability to manipulate the magnetic field, but to feel it, to understand its nuances, its ebb and flow, to become one with the rhythm." He then turned his attention to the disoriented enforcers, who were slowly being released from the magnetic grip. "You see, Director," Julian said, addressing Garrick, "power isn't about domination and control. The ability to control forces far greater than yourself." As if on cue, a contingent of Sterling banking house guards, clad in polished bronze armor and bearing meticulously crafted magnetic rifles, materialized from the shadows. They weren't there to suppress, they were there to observe. The Grand Governor, his face a mask of carefully controlled awe and simmering ambition, stepped forward. "My son," he said, his voice booming across the docks, "you have demonstrated a power beyond comprehension, a power that could reshape this entire continent." He gestured to the assembled guards. "We intend to harness this power, to use it to secure our legacy." Julian held up a hand, silencing him. "Your legacy will be built on exploitation," he said, his voice firm. "This power is not meant to be used for dominion, but for protection, for restoration. I intend to use it to rebuild this district, to uplift those who have been crushed by greed and corruption." He turned to Elena, a subtle smile playing on his lips. "And I believe you, High Overseer, are the key to that restoration." He paused, his gaze piercing. "You have seen the rhythm. Now, teach others to listen." With that, Julian began to demonstrate a series of intricate movements, his hands weaving patterns in the air, subtly manipulating the magnetic field around the docks. Small metal objects, loose bolts, discarded tools. Even the stones beneath their feet began to dance to his silent command, responding to the core's inherent rhythm. The onlookers gasped, realizing that Julian Sterling was not merely a powerful warrior. He was something far more profound, a conduit to an ancient, forgotten power, a magnet master shaping not just metal, but the very fabric of reality. Chapter 10: Echoes of the Core. The days following the Festival of the Mint were a whirlwind of frantic activity, orchestrated by Julian's swift and decisive actions. The docks, once a chaotic tangle of trade and desperation, were now eerily quiet, save for the steady clang of hammers and the organized bustle of rebuilding crews. The gleaming dreadnoughts, still a stark contrast to the weathered buildings, were undergoing rapid transformation, repurposed as mobile workshops and storage facilities. His father, the Grand Governor Zhao, was a constant, hovering presence, his earlier awe now replaced with a cold, calculating respect and a thinly veiled attempt to exert control. Julian, however, was less interested in consolidating power and more consumed with understanding the full extent of the magnetic core. Elena, initially bewildered and deeply cautious, proved to be an invaluable asset. She recognized the subtle shifts in the local magnetic field, the minute tremors of metal responding to Julian's control, a network of unseen currents woven throughout the city. She became his reluctant, fiercely intelligent teacher, patiently explaining the ancient theories of the core, drawing on forgotten metallurgical texts and the intuitive understanding passed down through generations of northern artisans. "It's not merely about manipulating metal, Julian," she explained one evening, meticulously examining a piece of intricately patterned bronze, its surface shimmering with a barely perceptible magnetic charge. "The core is a resonance. It responds to intention, to rhythm, to the very essence of balance. We are not forcing the metal, we are listening to its inherent potential." Their sessions were held in the newly established Imperial Mint, a grand space built with materials chosen for their magnetic properties, a foundation of obsidian reinforced with ironwood beams, and walls lined with specially treated copper panels. The air hummed with a low thrum, a tangible manifestation of the core's influence. Julian practiced relentlessly, his movements becoming more fluid, more controlled. He learned to subtly alter the flow of metal during the forging process, strengthening weak points, smoothing imperfections, and even imbuing tools with a resilience that defied conventional craftsmanship. The revelation of Garrick and Vance's fates, witnessed by a stunned delegation of Imperial officials, had cemented Julian's authority. The image of the two men, stripped of their wealth and condemned to a lifetime of brutal labor, was a potent symbol of his commitment to justice. However, the change wasn't universally embraced. Whispers followed Julian, fueled by the sudden and seemingly inexplicable appearance of this wealthy, powerful young man from nowhere. Some spoke of him being a demon in human form, a harbinger of disruption. Others, those deeply entrenched in the old order, suspected a conspiracy, a hidden alliance with rebellious factions. One evening, a lone figure approached Julian as he was overseeing the installation of a massive magnetic sorting machine, a device designed to automate the tedious process of separating metals. The figure was Master Li, a renowned martial arts instructor from the Imperial Academy, summoned by Julian after Elena's initial observations. Li was a man sculpted from granite, his face etched with decades of discipline, his movements radiating an ancient, almost unsettling stillness. "Sterling," Li said, his voice a low rumble, "your abilities are remarkable, but they are also unsettling. The core is a dangerous force. It requires a profound understanding, not merely manipulation." Julian regarded him with a carefully neutral expression. "Manipulation implies control," he replied, his hand subtly adjusting the magnetic field around the sorting machine, causing the scattered metal fragments to swirl with an almost hypnotic grace. "I believe the core responds to harmony, to the restoration of balance." Li remained unmoved. "Harmony can be forged through strength, Sterling, through the disciplined application of force. The core is a weapon, not a tool. Its potential for destruction is immense. You wield it lightly, and that is your greatest danger. He paused, his gaze intense. There are legends of core masters who succumbed to its power, who became consumed by its relentless energy, twisting themselves into monstrous reflections of its will. You must be wary, Sterling. Wary of the echo. As Lee spoke, Julian felt a subtle shift in the core's resonance, a faint tremor of something cold and unfamiliar. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced before, a sense of opposition, of a counter-frequency attempting to disrupt his control. He instinctively tightened his focus, reinforcing the magnetic field, pushing back against the intrusion. Elena, observing from the periphery, gasped. The echo, it's responding to your presence. It's learning. Her voice was laced with a growing sense of alarm. It's not just about metal, Julian. It's about awareness. About intention itself. Julian knew, with a chilling certainty, that List's words held a profound truth. The magnetic core wasn't merely a source of power. It was a living entity, and it was beginning to react to him, to the ripples of his influence in the world. The reckoning, he realized, was only just beginning. Chapter 11. Resonance of Steel. The air in the Imperial Mint hung thick with the scent of copper and the low hum of activated magnets. Elena, now seated at a meticulously crafted workstation, littered with intricate magnetic separators and gleaming tools, moved with a focused intensity that bordered on reverence. The massive hall, once a chaotic hive of coin sorters, was transformed into a precision laboratory, a testament to Julian's sudden and absolute control. He sat opposite her, not in a position of authority, but of shared purpose, a subtle shift in their dynamic that spoke volumes. The governor insists on immediate implementation of the grand standardization, Julian stated, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of his decision. He wishes to erase all irregularities, all the rogue coins, and establish a single, perfectly calibrated currency. It's naive, Elena. A blunt instrument for a complex problem. Elena nodded slowly, her brow furrowed. It will create further distortions. The core doesn't respond to forced uniformity. It seeks natural resonance. You showed me, Julian, that the instability lies not in the metal itself, but in the disruption of its flow. The standardization project, spearheaded by a team of zealous engineers, was already underway, utilizing massive magnetic coils to attempt to cleanse the city's coin supply. But the results were catastrophic. The city's copper coins, once a familiar comfort, began to pulse with erratic energy, producing hairline fractures and exhibiting unpredictable magnetic behavior. The engineers, baffled, blamed the instability on the impurities within the metal, demanding further corrections. Julian, observing this chaos from his position as High Overseer, realized the truth. He wasn't controlling the core, it was correcting him. The subtle intrusion Lee had warned him about was accelerating, amplified by his attempts to exert control. The core wasn't a weapon, it was a living mirror, reflecting the inherent disharmony of his own efforts. The governor's vision is predicated on control, Julian said, a grimness entering his voice. He believes he can dominate even the smallest things. But the core, it resists domination. It requires understanding. Suddenly, the magnetic field within the mint spiked violently. The air crackled with energy, and the automated separators shuddered, throwing off sparks. Elena, reacting instinctively, reached out, her hand hovering over a newly constructed magnetic containment chamber. "It's reacting to the standardization initiative," she shouted, her voice strained. "The energy is building, Julian. It's trying to eject." He raised his hand, and a wave of calm flowed from him, gently smoothing the chaotic fluctuations. The separators stilled, the sparks vanished, and the humming returned to a steady, controlled rhythm. "It's not ejection, Elena," he explained, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's resistance." The core is attempting to establish a natural equilibrium. He began to manipulate the magnetic field with painstaking precision, not to force a specific outcome, but to facilitate the core's natural correction. He visualized the flow of energy within the coins, seeing the inherent imbalances, the points of friction. He wasn't shaping the metal, he was guiding its inherent potential. As he worked, a strange sensation washed over him, a feeling of being observed, not just by Elena, but by something far older, far more profound. It wasn't a threat, exactly, but a deep, ancient knowing. He felt the echoes of countless core masters, each attempting to harness the power, each succumbing to the temptation of absolute control. "I'm hearing them," he whispered, his eyes fixed on a particularly stubborn coin displaying a strange magnetic distortion. "The echoes, they are guiding me." Elena stared at him, her face pale with a mixture of fear and fascination. "You're communicating with the core masters." "Not communicating, Elena," he corrected, his voice strained. "Resonating. They exist within the core, woven into its very fabric." Lee was right. It's not just about metal. It's about intention, about awareness. And the more I try to force it, the more dangerous it becomes. Just then, a tremor ran through the entire district. Not an earthquake, but a subtle shift in the magnetic field, emanating from the Sterling banking house. The governor's guards, alerted by the increased activity in the mint, rushed towards the building, their armor gleaming under the newly installed gaslights. Julian stood, his hand outstretched, the magnetic core humming with power. "It's coming for us, Elena," he said, his voice resolute. "And this time, it won't be a simple disruption. The core is evolving, learning. It's no longer just responding to me. It's responding to everything." He looked at Elena, a spark of terrifying understanding in his eyes. "The reckoning isn't just about Vance and Garrick. It's about the very nature of power, and the terrifying potential of an echo that never truly fades." Chapter 12. The resonance of steel. The air in the smelting vats was a suffocating stew of heat, sulfur, and the metallic tang of relentlessly sorted scrap. Vance and Garrick, stripped of their opulent uniforms and forced to wear rough-spun linen, moved with a grim, almost defeated monotony, their backs aching, their fingers raw and bleeding. The rhythmic clang of magnets against metal was a constant, brutal reminder of their downfall. They hadn't expected the abrupt end of their reign, let alone this humiliating, agonizing task. Meanwhile, within the grand halls of the Sterling banking house, Julian was undergoing a transformation. His father, the Grand Governor Li Wei, a man carved from granite and obsessed with control, was a strange, almost reverent figure. Had witnessed the devastation in the docks, a testament to a power had barely understood, and a peculiar humility had settled upon him. He spent hours observing Julian, a silent, watchful presence, occasionally issuing curt instructions that seemed less about command and more about observation. "The resonance is stronger here," Li Wei stated, his voice echoing in the vast, temperature-controlled chamber. "The core remembers its roots. It yearns for a conduit, a focus." He gestured towards a massive, intricately carved table, crafted from an unknown dark metal, the salvaged remains of the shattered broadsword, a single pulsing shard embedded within its center. "Your brother, Julian, possesses a latent capacity for this resonance. We must hone it." Julian, now clad in simple dark robes, stood before the table, his hands hovering over the shard. He felt the pulse of the core, not as a directed command, but as a complex, layered symphony. It wasn't just the magnetic field he manipulated, it was the inherent energy of metal, the flow of potential, the echoes of countless generations of core masters. "The governor is right," he said, his voice now imbued with a quiet authority. "The core isn't just responding to my will, it's feeding on the ambient magnetic energy of the entire continent. The constant churning of trade, the metallic heart of the imperial cities, even the steel of the war machines, it's a boundless source. Suddenly, a sharp, discordant vibration ripped through the chamber. The shard within the table flared with blinding light, throwing long, distorted shadows. Levi recoiled, clutching his chest. "The echo, it's amplifying," he shouted, his face contorted with a mixture of fear and a strange, unsettling fascination. "It's not just focusing on you, Julian. It's communicating." The shard began to spin, faster and faster, emitting a high-pitched whine that grated on the ears. Images flashed through Julian's mind, fleeting glimpses of ancient battles, of core masters wielding unimaginable power, of catastrophic failures that had nearly shattered the core entirely. He saw himself, not as a young man sorting coins, but as a miniature version of himself, a tiny, flickering spark within the greater whole. Elena, summoned to the chamber, watched in a state of profound apprehension. "It's feeding on your memories, Julian," she cried, her voice strained. "The core is trying to rewrite you." Julian fought against the influx of information, focusing his intent, channeling the core's energy through his body. He visualized a shield, a containment field, built around his mind, a lattice of magnetic energy designed to filter the overwhelming torrent. It was exhausting, draining, but he held firm, his face slick with sweat, his muscles coiled tight. "I'm building a buffer," he gasped, "a resonance dampener. But it's not enough. The core is learning, adapting. It anticipates my defenses." The room plunged into near darkness as the shard pulsed with an intense crimson light. The air crackled with energy. Then, from the center of the table, a single, perfectly formed steel coin materialized, a miniature replica of the broadsword's shattered fragment. It floated in the air, rotating slowly, pulsating with the same unsettling energy as the shard. "It's offering itself," Leeway whispered, his eyes wide with a dawning realization. "A tool, a weapon, an extension of the core's will." Julian recognized the intent. The coin wasn't just a physical object, it was a conduit, a point of amplification. He reached out, instinctively grasping for it. As his fingers brushed against the cold steel, the entire chamber resonated with a deafening roar. The steel coin exploded in a shower of shimmering fragments, not dispersing but converging, reforming into a single, perfectly formed razor-sharp blade that floated directly before Julian's face. It wasn't crafted by any mortal hand. It was pure magnetic energy, honed to a terrifying degree. "You've opened yourself to the full potential," Leeway said, his voice barely audible above the humming of the core. "The Sovereign of Iron is reborn. But be warned, Julian. The core doesn't offer power freely. It demands a price." Julian, standing before the newly formed blade, felt a chilling understanding. He was no longer just a coin sorter. He was a weapon, forged by a power beyond his comprehension, and he had no control over the hand that held the hammer. The reckoning had begun, not with the destruction of Vance and Garrick, but with the unleashing of a force that threatened to consume him entirely. Chapter 13. The Echo of the Forge. The rain in the lower docks had intensified, a greasy sheet clinging to the cobblestones and slicking the metal of the rebuilt forge. Elena, covered in soot and smelling faintly of molten copper, worked with a grim focus, meticulously inspecting the newly formed magnetic blade. It hung suspended in mid-air, pulsating with a faint internal light, the residual echo of the core's surge, a hypnotic rhythm that pulled at Julian's senses. He stood back, hands clenched, fighting a primal urge to reach out and touch it again. Leeway, ever vigilant, maintained a watchful stance beside him, his movements fluid and precise, a silent counterpoint to Julian's contained tension. "The resonance is diminishing," Leeway observed, his voice clipped. "The core has expended a significant portion of its energy during the display, but the connection, it's deepening." Julian nodded, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. The spectacle at the Festival of the Mint hadn't just exposed his abilities, it had irrevocably altered them. The initial surge had been terrifying, a visceral experience of raw, untamed power. Now, a lingering awareness of the core, a constant thrumming beneath his skin served as a chilling reminder of his new reality. He felt a strange kinship with the blade, a sense of symbiotic connection he couldn't quite articulate. "It's learning," he murmured, almost to himself, "responding to my intentions." Elena paused in her work, her brow furrowed. "Learning? The core doesn't learn, Julian. It reacts. It amplifies. This blade, it's a reflection of your will, shaped by its power. But the reflection is becoming independent." She gestured towards the blade with a calloused hand. "Look closer. Don't just see the metal. See the flow, the magnetic currents. It's not simply cutting metal. It's shaping it, influencing its behavior on a fundamental level." Julian followed her gaze, and the truth of her words slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. The blade wasn't just a weapon, it was an instrument of control, a tool to manipulate the very fabric of metal itself. He instinctively visualized a nearby pile of discarded iron rods, picturing them bending, twisting, rising to form a complex defensive structure. Almost instantly, the rods began to shift, coalescing with a silent, terrifying grace into a cage-like barrier that surrounded them. By the ancestors, Levi breathed, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Juve unlocked a new level of the core, the ability to construct, not just disrupt. Suddenly, the ground trembled. Not a violent tremor, but a subtle vibration, like a giant's footfall. Julian braced himself, instinctively reaching for the blade. He could feel it now, an almost tangible pressure building within him, a growing hunger for power. A voice, cold and devoid of emotion, echoed in his mind. It wasn't spoken aloud, but directly implanted into his consciousness. Potential untapped. Expansion required. He staggered back, clutching his head. What was that? Levi quickly assessed the situation. A residual fragment of the core's consciousness. It's trying to establish a direct link, to integrate itself more fully with your being. It's offering you more power, Julian, but it's not offering it freely. Before he could respond, the forge doors burst open, revealing a contingent of Vance's remaining enforcers, their faces grim and determined. They had been tracking the surge of magnetic energy, deploying remotely operated listening devices, and had finally pinpointed Julian's location. Leading the charge was Commander Zhao, a hulking brute with a scarred face and a penchant for brutal efficiency. "Sterling!" Zhao bellowed, leveling a massive, spiked club at Julian. "Surrender yourself. You are a traitor to the Empire." Julian didn't hesitate. He raised the magnetic blade, and the air crackled with energy. The blade, now imbued with an even greater degree of control, danced before him, weaving a complex web of magnetic force around Zhao and his men. The club, propelled by Zhao's swing, slammed into the ground with terrifying force, but the magnetic field deflected it, sending it spinning harmlessly away. The enforcers' armor became a prison, their weapons useless, their movements erratic, all controlled by the blade's invisible field. Julian moved with terrifying precision, dismantling their defenses with effortless grace. Elena, witnessing the scene unfold, instinctively moved to shield him, her hand flashing out with a small, precisely crafted hammer, disrupting the magnetic flow just long enough to allow Julian to evade a particularly forceful blast. As Julian moved to engage Zhao directly, he felt the core's voice again, louder now, more insistent. Embrace the flow. Become the iron. He realized then that the reckoning wasn't just about confronting Vance and his men. It was about accepting the core's influence, about becoming something more. But he also understood, with a chilling clarity, that to fully embrace the sovereign of iron meant losing himself entirely. The question wasn't whether he could control the power, but whether he could control it controlling him. Chapter 14. The crucibles embraced the stench of molten iron, and burnt oil clung to Julian's skin. A constant reminder of the brutal efficiency had unleashed. The grand hall of the newly constructed Imperial Mint, normally a place of meticulous order and the rhythmic clinking of coins, was now a chaotic tableau of salvaged metal, twisted steel, shattered brass, and the shimmering fragments of Vance's armor, arranged in unsettling patterns like a morbid still life. Elena, her face smudged with soot and exhaustion, oversaw the operation with a grim satisfaction, her hammer resting heavily in her calloused hand. "The flow is agreeable," she murmured, her eyes tracing the magnetic patterns etched into the newly cast bronze coins. "The core speaks through the metal, a symphony of repulsion and attraction." Julian, clad in simple, dark work, clothes a deliberate choice to downplay his former opulence, observed her with a newfound respect. The initial shock of revealing himself, of dismantling the Sterling banking house with a skill that bordered on the mythical, had begun to settle into a pragmatic understanding. He was not merely a man wielding extraordinary power, he was a conduit, a vessel for something ancient and immensely potent. The magnetic core wasn't just a martial art, it was a living entity, feeding off the very structure of the world. The Enforcer's resistance was predictable, he said, his voice low, the words vibrating with a subtle energy. Their armor, designed for brute force, was fundamentally incapable of handling the directed control. It was like trying to stop a river with a dam. He gestured towards the scattered debris. A flawed design, inherently reliant on linear force when dealing with a force that seeks to negate it entirely. He turned his attention to a group of young apprentices, clad in apprentices' uniforms, meticulously sorting and separating small metal flakes. He wasn't issuing orders, but demonstrating. Holding out his hand, he focused his concentration, a barely perceptible hum resonating around him. A small copper coin, dropped from the hand of one of the apprentices, began to tremble, then lifted, spinning slowly in the air before settling gently into his palm. "Precision," he explained, his voice resonating with the same quiet authority he'd displayed in the docks. "The core isn't about overwhelming force, it's about control. It's about understanding the infinitesimal dance of attraction and repulsion." Suddenly, a sharp clang echoed through the hall. Master Lin, a wizened veteran of the Imperial Guard, stepped forward, his face etched with concern. "Your Highness, the Governor's representatives are arriving. They are insistent." Julian's brow furrowed. The Governor, his own father, was a man driven by ambition and a deep-seated distrust of anyone who challenged his authority. Had arrived with a delegation of heavily armed officials, intent on asserting control and demanding answers. Julian knew a direct confrontation would be disastrous. He could crush them with the magnetic core, but that would only confirm the rumors, solidifying his position as an unpredictable, dangerous force. "Let them come," Julian said, his voice calm but firm. "But tell them that this is a place of learning, not a battlefield." As the delegation entered a pompous array of silk robes and stern faces, the atmosphere immediately shifted. The Governor, a man named Lord Gao, radiated barely concealed fury. "Sterling," he boomed, his voice echoing through the hall, "you have disrupted the natural order. You have revealed a power that belongs to the Empire, and you have used it to undermine the very foundation of our authority." Julian remained impassive, his gaze fixed on Zhao. "The natural order you speak of is one built on exploitation and corruption," he countered, his voice measured. "The Sterling banking house preyed on the vulnerable, hoarded wealth, and enforced tyranny. This mint, this academy, will be dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge and the upliftment of the people." Lord Gao sputtered. "You dare accuse the Empire of corruption? We uphold justice. We maintain order." "Order built on lies," Elena interjected, her voice surprisingly steady. "Order enforced by greed." Julian didn't acknowledge her. Instead, he turned his attention to the Governor. "I understand your concern for the stability of the Empire. However, I propose a different solution. Let me demonstrate the potential of this new technology, not as a weapon of force, but as a tool for prosperity. Let me show you how this understanding of magnetic forces can be used to improve mining techniques, optimize trade routes, and enhance the security of our borders. He paused, letting his words hang in the air. He could feel the core within him pulsing, a relentless pressure urging him to unleash its full power. But he resisted, focusing instead on presenting himself as a rational, pragmatic leader, a man who understood the needs of the Empire, not a dangerous anomaly. I will offer my services, he concluded, his voice gaining a subtle, almost hypnotic quality. But I will need your cooperation. And perhaps, he added, a flicker of steel in his eyes, a few guarantees. The air crackled again, a low hum growing in intensity. The magnetic core was stirring, preparing for the next stage of the reckoning. Chapter 15. The Resonance of Gold. The following weeks were a carefully constructed dance of appearances. Julian, now formally designated Sterling, advisor to the Imperial Treasury, moved through the Imperial Court with a studied grace that bordered on unsettling. His initial offer of the magnetic core's potential had been met with a cautious, almost frightened curiosity from Lord Gaudon. The governor, a man of rigid protocol, and even more rigid convictions, had demanded demonstrations, small-scale tests initially, meticulously overseen by a contingent of Imperial Guard. Julian, ever the calculated strategist, had obliged, subtly bending iron bars, levitating small coins with barely perceptible movements, and demonstrating the enhanced efficiency of a magnet-powered sorting system. The initial reactions were a mixture of awe and suspicion. Some whispered of demonic influence, others of a forgotten god awakening. But Julian skillfully deflected the superstitious anxieties, presenting his abilities as a revolutionary application of geomancy, a science of manipulating unseen forces, refined through generations of Sterling family study, a secret passed down through bloodline. He emphasized the potential for increased productivity, reduced waste, and unparalleled security, framing the magnetic core not as a weapon, but as the ultimate tool for a thriving empire. Garrick, predictably, remained a constant irritant. He shadowed Julian relentlessly, a sneering caricature of insecurity, attempting to provoke a display of power that would confirm the rumors of his dark arts. Julian, however, met his taunts with deliberate calm, occasionally engaging in brief, carefully controlled demonstrations subtly altering the trajectory of a thrown dart, causing a stack of porcelain cups to momentarily float, always leaving enough ambiguity to fuel the rumors but never enough to truly frighten. Elena, meanwhile, found herself in a position of unexpected influence. Lord Gao, recognizing her expertise and the genuine, almost unnerving intelligence in her eyes, appointed her to a newly formed council dedicated to evaluating the applications of the magnetic core. She proved a vital, and occasionally infuriating, asset. Her pragmatic skepticism challenged Julian's more idealistic proposals, demanding quantifiable data and meticulous analysis. She questioned the ethics of controlling metal with such force, reminding him of the ancient Taoist principles of balance and harmony. You wield a power that is, fundamentally, destructive, Sterling, she stated one evening, as they discussed optimizing the mine shafts in the Dragon's Tooth Mountains. To manipulate the very essence of matter, it is a dangerous arrogance. Remember, the Earth provides, but it demands respect. Julian simply nodded, the subtle shift of his magnetic field barely perceptible. He understood her concerns, but he also recognized the immense potential. He was learning, slowly, to navigate the complexities of imperial politics, a dance of diplomacy and veiled threats. The true test came during the annual Imperial Harvest Festival. Gao, desperate to solidify his position and demonstrate the Empire's control over dangerous innovations, had decreed a spectacular public demonstration of the magnetic core's power. A colossal bronze dragon, meticulously crafted and weighing several tons, was to be suspended in mid-air and maneuvered through a complex series of movements, a symbol of the Empire's strength and mastery. Julian, naturally, was the centerpiece. As the dragon rose majestically from the central plaza, suspended by a complex system of counterweights and magnetic supports, Garrick seized his opportunity. With a guttural shout, he lunged forward, wielding his massive broadsword, aiming a precise blow at the dragon's head. This time, however, Julian didn't hesitate. The low hum returned, louder, more insistent, building to a resonating crescendo. He didn't simply deflect the blade, he amplified it. The magnetic field surrounding the dragon surged, not with resistance, but with a focused, destructive energy. The sword, already weakened by Garrick's erratic movements, vibrated violently, the jagged fragments erupting outwards with a blinding flash of light. But it wasn't just the sword that was affected. The entire bronze dragon shuddered, its metallic structure resonating with the core's power. The intricate carvings began to distort, the metal itself warping and melting under the immense pressure. Panic erupted in the plaza as the colossal sculpture began to crumble, collapsing in a shower of molten bronze and shattered metal. Garrick, momentarily stunned, watched in horror as the meticulously crafted symbol of the Empire crumbled before him. Julian, his face impassive, stood amidst the chaos, a faint shimmer of magnetic energy still radiating from his hands. Lord Gao, his face contorted with rage, roared, "Seize him! Arrest him for treason!" But before the Imperial Guard could move, Elena stepped forward, placing herself directly between Julian and the advancing soldiers. "Stop!" she commanded, her voice amplified by the lingering resonance of the magnetic core. "Do not attempt to suppress this power. You underestimate it. And more importantly, you misunderstand its purpose." A palpable tension filled the plaza. The hum intensified, the air itself vibrating with potential. Julian, seeing a window of opportunity, subtly increased the intensity of the magnetic core. The ground beneath their feet began to shift, a low rumble echoing through the stones. He was no longer just an advisor to the treasury, he was the sovereign of iron, and the Empire was about to learn the true extent of his power.